Today's Premier League might look like polished stadiums, global fans, and family-friendly football. But behind the glossy image lies a darker history. In the 1970s and 80s, English hooligan firms built reputations that still echo through the terraces today. Some became infamous worldwide. Others never quite lived up to the hype. In this video, we're counting down the top 10 Premier League hooligan firms, ranked from worst to best. And trust me, number 1 won't surprise you, but the order along the way just might. At number 10, Southampton's Scum Army, also known as the Inside Crew or the Uglies. The Dell had a reputation for being a tight, hostile ground, but only if you were a smaller club. When the big boys rolled in, it was a different story. Manchester United completely took over in 1974. West Ham are said to have done the same. Even Chelsea claimed the Milton End in the late 70s. For years, the Scum Army barely registered outside the South Coast. They were there, but never really a force on the national scene. Today, they've re-emerged here and there, but in the pecking order of Premier League firms, Southampton start our list right at the bottom. At number 9, Aston Villa's Villa Hardcore. The Holty End was one of the biggest single terraces in England, and you'd think that would make it untouchable. But history tells a different story. In 1976, Rangers traveled down for a so-called friendly and took the Holte End. Chelsea repeated the trick in 79 and 83. Even West Ham had their day here. Villa Hardcore could put out numbers, no doubt about it. But when it came to mixing it with the very top firms, they rarely dominated. They had the size, just not the same fear factor. A proud following, yes. But as far as reputation among the firms goes, Villa never hit the elite level. At number 8, Arsenal's firm, The Herd. North London has never been short of rivalries, and The Herd made their name through the 70s and 80s. But for all the numbers Arsenal could put out, the North Bank wasn't always theirs to keep. West Ham were known to stroll in during the 70s. Spurs had their moments too. Away from London, The Herd rarely made the kind of statement wins that the biggest firms are remembered for. A few trips abroad gave them some credibility, but in the firm scene, Arsenal never quite lived up to the scale of their club. Plenty of noise, plenty of presence, but not quite enough to climb higher on this list. At number 7, Newcastle United's Toon Army and their most notorious offshoot, the Gremlins. Newcastle always had one big advantage: distance. Wherever they traveled, it was hundreds of miles, and they took pride in showing up in big numbers. Few clubs could match their dedication on the road. The Gremlins in particular had a reputation for being game in the 80s, known for violence and for standing their ground. But being so far removed from London and the Midlands, they rarely mixed it with the top mobs week in, week out. Respected for loyalty? Yes. But as far as sheer impact on the national scene, Newcastle's firms fall just outside the top tier. At number 6, Manchester City's Guvnors. Emerging in the late 80s, they were one of the first firms to blend the casual scene with rave culture. Stylish on the outside, but more than capable of turning it on when needed. The Guvnors built a reputation in Manchester and beyond, but they were always living in the shadow of United's Red Army. Where United traveled in thousands, City rarely matched that scale. Still, the Guvnors were well organized, respected in their own right, and not to be underestimated. They were sharp, they were game, just never quite the dominant force across the country. At number 5, Everton's County Road Cutters. While Liverpool's Cop was making headlines around the world, the blue half of Merseyside was carving out its own reputation. The Cutters weren't the biggest in numbers, but they were fiercely organized. On derby days, they gave as good as they got. Across the 70s and 80s, Everton's mob was respected for being sharp, direct, and always up for it. Outside Merseyside, they didn't dominate the national picture, but locally, the County Road Cutters built a fearsome reputation that still lingers today. Tough, game, and never an easy day out at Goodison Park. At number 4, Tottenham's Yid Army. Spurs could always put out numbers, and in London that mattered. The South Stand at White Hart Lane had a reputation for being hostile, and when it came to clashes with West Ham or Chelsea, Spurs were right in the thick of it. Those London derbies were some of the most explosive of the era. Nationally, Spurs didn't always carry the same fear factor as the very biggest firms, but they were no soft touch either. If Spurs turned up, it was in force, and they made themselves known. The Yid Army might not have dominated everywhere, but in the capital, they were always a major player. At number 3, Chelsea's Headhunters. Few names strike as much fear in English football hooligan history. The Shed End was one of the most dangerous places to stand in the late 70s and 80s. The Headhunters built a reputation for being ruthless, whether at home or on the road. They weren't just about numbers, but about sheer menace. Clashes with West Ham, Millwall, and Spurs cemented their status as one of London's most notorious firms. By the late 80s, their name carried weight far beyond Stamford Bridge. Loved by their own, hated by rivals, the Chelsea Headhunters were the real deal. At number 2, Manchester United's Red Army. United's away following in the 70s and 80s was legendary and notorious. Town after town saw trains of United fans pour in, taking over pubs, squares, and terraces. In 1974, they virtually owned Southampton's Dell, a day still talked about in hooligan folklore. The Red Army weren't always the most organized, but in sheer numbers, they were unmatched. Tens of thousands on the road, week in, week out. For many, they were the face of English football trouble in the 70s. Their name carried across the country, feared, infamous, and impossible to ignore. At number 1, West Ham's inner city firm. The ICF rewrote the rules of English hooliganism. Unlike many firms, they were tightly organized, often traveling by train to stage planned clashes. Their calling card, literally, was leaving behind business cards stamped, "Congratulations, you've just met the ICF." In the 80s, they became the most infamous name in football trouble. From the streets of East London to away grounds up and down the country, they mixed brains with brawn, earning both respect and fear in equal measure. For better or worse, the ICF defined an era and remained the most iconic hooligan firm in Premier League history.